Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. al-Athar al-Islamiyyah is delighted to welcome a member of the staff of one of the most prestigious museums in the UK, the V&A Museum. Tonight's scholar, Mr. Tim Stanley, is a prominent art historian. As senior curator of the Middle East for the Middle Eastern collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum of London, his activities as curator, developer, and author are too many to list. A prolific writer, he has written a variety of essays on a range of topics connected to the Islamic world and to the Ottoman culture. Tonight's lecture is entitled Firearms in the Middle East, Technology, Status, and Ornament, 16th to 18th centuries. While we think of swords and daggers or objects of Islamic art, we seldom think of them as firearms. Mr. Stanley will be shedding light on this sometimes neglected aspect of Islamic art. These firearms in their days made a lot of noise. In our times, it is the mobile phones that make those noises. So in order to enjoy his discussions of these precious objects, please disarm your telephones, and let's welcome Mr. Tim Stanley.
Good evening, and I'd like to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here, even if it's only just to hear the jokes you make. And thank you very much for the invitation, because this is my first visit to Kuwait, and I'm very glad to be able to cross it off my bucket list. So this evening I'm going to be talking to you about firearms, and I hope that what I'm going to say is not too dry, because I'm going to cover the technology in the respect that how guns were fired in the Ottoman Empire. And then I'm going to try and talk about the change of status that took place at the beginning of the 18th century, when sultans and higher members of Ottoman society started to practice their marksmanship. And that leads me on to the gun in the V&A, which has a very particular type of ornament, which I'm going to hope that I can explain. And in fact, I could have done, and perhaps maybe people would even have preferred a lecture that actually looked into how guns were ornamented. But actually, all the way that all the time I've been doing this over the last few years, looking at it, I've really been caught constantly by the difficulties of actually saying anything, because so little research has been done before, and we can't actually start talking about the ornament itself unless we know why it's there. And so I've chosen one particular instance of the ornamenting of a gun where I think I know why it's been done in a very particular way. So I appeal for your patience as I go through this, and hope they're pleased with the gun at the end. So one of the... a picture. So it's certain that the Ottomans used firearms, and what usually happens is that people start with the reign of Sultan Mehmed II in the middle of the 15th century, and they like to say that the fall of Constantinople, when in 1453, Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, and to do so, he had some very large guns cast. And in fact, in Britain, we have one of the guns from this period at Fort Nelson in Portsmouth. And it's absolutely enormous. It's 5.18 meters long. It weighs 16.8 tons, and it fired stone balls up to 0.63 meters in diameter. So it's an oversized bombard. And it was last fired, believe it or not, in 1807. And it was last fired at a British ship during the, one of the turns in the Napoleonic Wars when the British were trying to force the Dardanelles. And so the British asked for it as a present when Sultan Abdulaziz came to London in 1867, and he gave it to Queen Victoria. So this is these guns are the first famous Ottoman guns because they're so big. You know, they're very, very impressive. But it's always said that the technology for these guns came from Central Europe. So you have Hungarians and Germans, Jürg of Nuremberg and Orban the Hungarian, being drafted into the Ottoman service in order to produce them. And you know, this is quite normal, but it isn't an sort of Middle Eastern or Islamic or Ottoman dependence on Western technology. It's the way that the shared technology passed around the world. And as my former teacher, Colin Imbers, pointed out, no one says it's at all odd when a German armourer or gunsmith comes to London and makes guns. Nobody makes a big fuss about that. It's when they go to Istanbul and suddenly it becomes this issue that the Ottomans had no idea what they were doing and this European came and taught them how. So yes, different people make different advances and then those copies are immediately copied by their enemies, and that's part of the story I'm going to tell. But the dominance of the idea that the Europeans invented everything is not true, and I'm going to try and unpick that a bit. Now, basically, the history of cannon was as little understood as the history of handheld guns, which I'm going to go into, until 10 years ago, Gabor Argoston, who's a Hungarian who works in America, came up with this book, Guns for the Sultan, which actually really unravels a lot about the history of cannon in the Ottoman Empire. And if we look at this miniature, which comes from a copy of the Khamsa of an Ottoman poet of no great fame called Nevizade Atayi, and the copy was made in 1721, and it's now in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And you can see that oh, there's the picture, but here's what I wanted to show you, which is it's not such a good photo, but it's much brighter. And you can see that these are the Ottomans, and these are their European enemy, the Poles. And you can see that the Ottomans have lots of cannon, and they've also got 2 mortars, 3 mortars. And at the front of the line, you've got soldiers with handguns. So you can see that by 1721, even people doing miniatures, which was illustrations to manuscripts, which was a thoroughly Islamic idea and was usually ruled by all sorts of conventions, the conventions have broken down, and suddenly you see contemporary reality breaking through. And that indeed, in the early 18th century, by the early 18th century, the Ottomans were using all sorts of firearms. But this is the sort of image that the Ottoman like to present of their upper classes. This is a painting of Sultan Ahmed I at the beginning of the 17th century. And you can see that at this time, the Sultan is shown with, picking the wrong thing up. You can see that he's got very beautifully, with henna on the horse's tail and around his, oh dear, I can't remember the proper word for that part of the horse. And you can see this fantastic harness, which is gold with jewels. And you can see that he is an armed man because he has a splendid sword. And so at this point, the Ottoman upper class are keen to show themselves as being skilled with the sword and other edge weapons, with the lance and with the bow. But that doesn't mean that there weren't guns even at this stage. So this is an illustration that was done for an album that was prepared in about 1590-91, and it was then taken to the Habsburg lands and was given as a present to the Emperor Rudolph. And what we see is the Sultan, this is Murad III here, And you can see that this is the grandfather of the previous man we saw. We can see that there's something of a... this is a painter from another tradition who is depicting the Sultan autonomously, and he shows him in very much the same way. Here's his sword. Here are the wonderful trappings for the horse. But in this instance, we've also got two of the Sultan's guards who are protecting him, armed with muskets. And if we look at the musket, the guard on this side of him is handling, we can see some of the detail of how the musket works. It's here we've got a thing which is the match holder, and this is also called a serpentine because it is bent like a snake. And here we've got the flash pan, which is the little pan which contains the primer which the match lighted, which caused the explosion which fired the bullet. And in this case, the flash pan's cover is over it. And in his right hand, he's holding the actual match, which is a piece of cord, which is a light. And the idea is that normally the match would be held in this little vise, which is at the end of the serpentine. But there was a problem with that, because if you walk around with a weapon that's got its match alight, and that means it could be fired accidentally, and you're in the presence of the Sultan, you could actually fire it without meaning to, and you might actually harm or kill the Sultan. So you didn't want to do that. At the same time, you wanted to be ready, so you held the match in your other hand, so separately from the gun, so you're always ready to repel any attacks or on the Sultan or any threat to the Sultan. But seems to be a wonderful painting of the sort of firearms that were used by the Ottomans. So this is the introduction to us looking at the Ottoman matchlock gun and its possible origins. So here's a modern Western type of matchlock gun. You can see here's the serpentine, here's the match, the cord, which is held in it, and here's the pan with its cover over it. If you move the pan, you light as I said, you light the match, and the cord, when you press the trigger, this pushes down, this releases the serpentine, which then lights the charge. And here, this is very similar to the one you see here. And here is an illustration of an Ottoman matchlock gun from 1732. And you can see that here the serpentine is actually pointing the other way. That's a possibility in European guns. The serpentine can either point forwards or it can point backwards. And just to take it a bit further, here's a matchlock gun with the serpentine pointing backwards, actually being fired. And you can see that it's technically the same as these. But actually, after spending some time looking at these images, I should say that the printed image is actually from this work, the L'État militaire de l'Empire Ottoman, which is by Count Marsigli, who was from Bologna. And he actually spent time in captivity in the Ottoman Empire, so he appears to know what he's talking about. And he may well have done, except that this book was published in the Netherlands in 1732, and he died in 1730. So this is a posthumous publication. So you have the right to feel a little bit as though he wasn't quite in control of the illustrations. And here's his illustration of the matchlock, and underneath it is the illustration of the gun with the flint-based mechanism. But if we look at the extraordinary thing, there is absolutely no connection whatsoever between those two illustrations and how Ottoman guns actually looked. This is an Ottoman gun of a matchlock type. This was actually is still in the collection of Count Marsigli in Bologna. So it is extraordinary the difference between the two. And this shows you that people are just not paying attention to the characteristics of Ottoman guns, because it is absolutely standard that whereas the serpentine is fixed to the exterior of the gun in the Western matchlocks, in Ottoman guns, the match holder always protrudes from the interior of the weapon, of the stock. So it is always inside, the mechanism is inside the gun, not on the outside. And yet the Westerners who made those two depictions are so completely unaware of what they're doing that they give false information. And this, you can trace the history of this, or rather the prevalence of that form of gun from the Ottoman Empire, through the Arab lands, across India, and back to China. And we have this Chinese publication of 1598, the Shen Qi Pu of Zhao Shijun. And what happened was that although the Chinese had actually invented the types of firearms, and this technology had then gone westwards to maybe to India, Southeast Asia, India, to the Middle East, and then eventually got to Europe. They didn't necessarily make the same advances as were being made elsewhere. And so when the Portuguese arrived in the Far East, they first arrived there in 1511, they went to Japan, and they introduced the matchlock gun to Japan. And eventually it got into the hands of Japanese pirates. And the Japanese pirates started to attack the coast of China. So the Ming Empire went into a sort of little bit of a military crisis in which they didn't know how to respond to this advance by Japanese pirates who were attacking their country. And so they then did a consultation in which they tried to find out from the people who were around who knew about guns who had the best ones. So they published, this book was published as a comparison of the Portuguese matchlock gun, in which the mechanism is shown on the outside of the gun, and this is an accurate depiction of the type of gun that's used by the Ottomans. Now, the people who told Zhao Shijun about this gun, they were called Lumi, which could be the Chinese form of the Arab name Rumi, meaning from Anatolia. So they could well have been Ottomans, especially by this date, 1598. But I'm not so sure about that, because we're not so up on the relationship between how many Ottomans actually got to China, but it's that everyone else has accepted that they are indeed Ottomans who are teaching the Chinese about their own gun technology. So you can see here that as on the actual Ottoman gun we saw before, that the match holder is actually internal to the gun, as you can see here. So it seems that while the illustrators in Europe weren't up to copying accurately what was going on, the people in China in 1598 were very interested in it. So if we look at what Count Marsili said about firearms and the Ottomans, he says, the employment of firearms has reached them to the Christians, firstly through the iniquity of certain men who, either out of avarice or for vengeance, have taught them it, and then by the test they have made of it themselves in the wars which they have had with us in Europe. The siege of Candia has made them ever better acquainted with how they had to make use of them, and it was on these principles that they carried out that of Vienna. Later in this war, they began to make use of several other sorts of arms that they were not familiar with, and that the Christians taught them to handle. So there we are. Somebody who died in 1730 is already convinced that it's the Christian Europeans who have given the Ottomans firearms. And this is a tradition that has been constant in Western writing about firearms. V.J. Parry, who wrote the part of the Baroud article that is the gunpowder article in the Encyclopedia of Islam in 1960, he wrote that the arquebus was taken over in about 1440 to 1443 during the Hungarian Wars. And he also explains how the use was much extended in the reign of Mehmed II. And he says, a large share in the transmission of these new arms fell to the peoples of Serbia and Bosnia. Artillerists and arquebusiers were recruited in these countries and still retaining their Christian faith and known to have been in the service of Mehmed II. So this theory just does not work. How come the Ottomans have got the same type of gun as the Indians and probably the people in the Mamluk Empire, and yet they're supposed to have learned how to use them from a load of peasants in Serbia and Bosnia? It just does not work. And so my answer to this is that actually what we have to look at is what happened during the Mamluk-Ottoman War in 1485 to 1491. Because there is, the next time that Parry finds the data on the improvement in the Ottoman system is something that happened immediately after the end of this war in 1491. That he finds reports that the Ottomans have started to use new types of handguns and other weapons, other firearms, at precisely this time. And he says that the reason for doing this is because the Ottomans had lost this war. And this is absolutely true. That this was the point at which the Mamluk Sultanate under Sultan Qaitbay was still very strong. And the Ottomans tried to seize, they were extending their power eastwards into Anatolia, and they came up against the Mamluk zone of influence, which covered the Dul-Gadirids and the Ramazan Orlus in this part. The Ramazan Orlus are here, and the Dul-Gadirids are here. And so these two tribal groups in Anatolia formed some of the sort of forward defences of the Mamluks. And the Ottomans tried to conquer this territory, and they lost in a big way. And if we then think about it in terms of if you lose a war against someone, and they're much better than you in some aspect, you copy them. It's absolutely standard in the whole of history. And so I'm saying that it's much more likely that this big upgrade of the muskets that the Ottomans were using, and probably this better type of matchlock musket or arquebus that was being used by the Ottomans throughout the 16th century, I'm saying that it's just as likely that it was transmitted from the Mamluk Empire in the 1490s. In fact, it's more likely because it's the same type of technology that you find in the Islamic and other states further east. So you can see that there's progress coming across Asia. My theory is that the Mamluks had this, and that it was then transmitted to the Ottomans. And in fact, saying that goes against what most people think about the use of firearms in the Mamluk Empire, because David Ayalon, in a book he published in 1956, his theory was that the Mamluks lost power because they didn't use firearms properly. They adopted them too late, and they didn't. And so he sees the collapse of the Mamluk Empire in 1516 to 17 was because the Ottomans, who'd got their weapons from the Europeans, were using them against the Mamluks, who then collapsed. But in fact, his idea that it's the Mamluks who start to use these firearms after the victory of 1491 is completely the opposite of what actually happened. Why would you start to upgrade your armaments if you've just magnificently won a war? And in fact, Robert Irwin has since written an article called Gunpowder and Firearms in the Mamluk Sultanate Reconsidered, and he shows very, very convincingly that the Mamluks had been using handheld guns since at least the 1340s, that the Mamluk Sultanate was ahead of the Ottomans in the war of 1485 to 91 in terms of firearms, And then he gives the example that Sultan Qaitbay Bey had an elite corps trained in the use of the arquebus, and these men were equipped with camels and sent off to fight the Ottomans in 1490. It was a remarkably successful campaign, and the following year Bayezid II sued for peace. So you can see that I think that, at least in the case of the matchlock, this whole story is completely the wrong way round. And I hope this is giving you an idea that although I would like to give you an overview of the subject, this whole history of these firearms is having to be rewritten piece by piece. And I'm going to give you the little bits I've found so far this evening. So the other type of firearm that the Ottomans used in the latter part of the period we're covering, that is in the 17th century and 18th century, was something called the Miquelet lock. And we're going to look at the Miquelet lock and its possible origin. Because here we do move to this, we have to understand that although we might, as sort of Middle Eastern nationalists, want everything to come from the Middle East, actually what we've had is this idea that only Europe produced these ideas, and now I'm trying to get the idea that there's a circulation of ideas, and in this case, the idea almost certainly came from Europe to the Ottomans. So here, from Count Marsigli, is at the bottom, for B, we find the this gun with a flint mechanism. Now, this is not... there's a problem with the way that people talk about the history of arms and armour in England, at least, and maybe in America as well, which is you have to be very precise in your terms, and you're not allowed to use the word flintlock for anything except the mechanism that was invented in France in the reign of Louis XIII. So even though this lock has got a flint in it, if I was to tell you it was a flintlock, I'd be putting myself outside the circle of those who know. And so I have to use terms like flint-based mechanism. And in fact, it is different from the later flintlock because it's a part of a group of mechanisms that are called the snap haunts. And the word snap in it becomes, you'll see that it becomes very much part of the story. And actually, snap haunts is a Dutch term that's come into English. And in order to show you how a snap haunts works, I'm going to use some images that I stole off Wikipedia. That's what we all do these days when we're preparing lectures. But this is of a snap haunts lock, because I haven't got any similar pictures of a Miquelet lock, but they work in very similar terms. So what you've got is you've got this part of the mechanism's called a cock, and you can see that it's got a vise which has got a piece of flint in it. And it's actually held back, it's under tension, it's held back by a catch, or what's called a sear, which is hidden just around here. And at the other end of the mechanism, you've got a thing called the steel. And you can see that it's on an arm, and that the arm moves on this. You can see it's got a screw. And the steel is the same piece as the cover for the pan. So that flash pan, this tiny flash pan which has a very small charge in it, is behind this round thing. And to show you, we can see it because this is the same lock from the other side. And you can see this is the flash pan, and you can see that the steel is actually covering it. So this is under tension. This is flexible, but it's resting over the flash pan. And what happens is when you press the trigger, this releases the sear. Now you can see it. The cock moves forwards, and it's hit the steel, which has flown backwards. But in hitting the steel, it creates a spark, which falls into the flash pan, which, because the steel has been knocked backwards, it is open, and the spark falls into the flash pan, and it explodes, and then the explosion goes through to the barrel, and that fires the bullet. And now you can see it from the other side. But the nodding means that I don't think I have to go through it again. People seem to have understood that. And here, I can't show you the whole lot in Ottoman guns, but here's 2 Ottoman guns in a German collection, and here is the mechanism when it's the cock's held back, and here the cock is fired and the steel has been knocked forward, just to show you that the same mechanism is used on the Ottoman guns. Now, the interesting thing is that the Miquelet or Miquelet name for this type of mechanism, it actually is a Catalan word. And currently we're all more familiar with the Catalans and how different they are from the Spanish. But Miquelet means little Michael. And little Michael is a word that's used in lots of Mediterranean countries to mean an irregular soldier in the 17th century. And so English collectors of firearms in the 19th century, because this mechanism was so commonly used in Spain in the 17th century, they gave it the name Miquelet, because they are the sorts of people who went round with these handguns and took part in campaigns or civil disorders at the time. And anyone who's read I Promessi Sposi by Manzoni can know that the soldiers he describes at the beginning are the same type as Micheletti, as they're called in Italian, who would have had this type of gun. And that's why Marsili, when he describes it, says, you can see the legend for this figure is B, and the text is in Italian and French. And the Italian says, another musket with a lock more similar to the Spanish than to any other type. And so you can see that this idea that the lock type is Spanish and that it probably came from Spain was very widespread in the literature on guns until the middle of the century. And in fact, if you look at this map, you can see that here's Spain, here's Catalonia, and in fact, the area in which it was commonly used, the Miquelet lock, was here, and other types were used in Italy, and so it's just one more leap for it to go to the Ottoman Empire. And so, it was a possibility that that the transmission is from Spain. But when I was working on this, I went to a source I was familiar with, but where I had not ever read anything about guns. And I discovered that, in fact, there's an Ottoman source of 1640 that actually tells you where this new type of lock came from. And that's this text, which was, what happened was, and this is part of the story, as you'll find, that in the 17th century, the Ottomans were in a parlous state in terms of their finances. And they weren't producing enough specie, enough gold and silver, to actually be able to remint their own coin. And so by the middle of the century, they'd stopped minting silver and gold coins, which is a very important sign of sovereignty. And what they were doing instead was they were using European coins. And this is all to do with a great shift in the monetary economy of the world, where, of course, you have vast amounts of silver coming from South and Central America and coming to Spain, and then causing economic problems across the world as it goes out. And so in 1640, the Ottomans decided to do something about it, and they issued a new basic silver coin for the empire, which is called the akça, or in English, the asper, but it's basically a silver penny. And when they did this, they sent the market inspectors round the markets of Istanbul, and they recorded a representative sample of every type of goods that was traded in the Istanbul market. They recorded the old price, and then they also recorded the new price, because it had to be reduced to take account of the fact that a new akça had been issued. And this 1640 document, which is quite long, gives us an enormous amount of information on the material culture of the Ottoman Empire, or of Istanbul, at that precise moment. And here is there's a section on tüfekciğans. Now, tüfek is the Turkish and Persian word for a handgun. And the tüfekçis, I thought when I first saw it, would mean the people who made handguns. But in fact, you can tell from the list that what they're talking about is the people who sell handguns second-hand, because all of the goods seem to be pre-owned in the sense that they're in various conditions. But you could buy a barrel with a lock attached, and you could fit it with a stock of your choice. So you can see this. The first item in the list is a musket which still has its stock on it. And this is the one which is most expensive, and it's described in the greatest detail. A musket with a barrel with a watered pattern. That's referring to the effect that you get when you use the Ottoman production technique to make a barrel. In fact, in the Italian sources of the 17th century actually think that Ottoman barrels are better than their own. And one with a watered pattern was sure to be a good one, because the watered pattern is created by combining steel and iron together in the making of the gun. And then if you drop acid on the surface, the bits which have got steel in it are more resistant to the acid than the bits with iron in them. And therefore you get a reflection of the constitution of the steel stroke iron mixture in a water pattern that appears on the surface of the gun. But I can't go into that sort of detail for all of these technical terms, and partly because I don't understand them. For example, this word mudahil doesn't really occur in Ottoman dictionaries at all. And I think what it is encrustations. But what I'm trying to give you is the idea that this list is very, very useful, but actually it's very difficult to understand what it means in detail, and that you have to spend a lot of time concentrating on it. So there's the first one. And then we've got 3 more muskets which haven't got their stocks. And it's full of interesting details, such as number 3, musket firing bullets weighing 5 dirhams, the rifled barrel 5 spans long, the midahils, which I think is the incrustation, the capucines and the sight. The capucines are the barrel bands, and the sight are in silver. And it was made. This barrel was made in the state workshop from old horseshoes. And of course, horseshoes are worked all the time in their life, and so they may well have been considered very good material for making a barrel from. And then we move on to number 5, and it describes it as having a tabanja of Hungarian manufacture. And then in the next one, it says that it has a Hungarian-style tabanja. But the trouble is that the word tabanja means pistol. So how can you have a musket barrel with a watered pattern that's 5 spans long, and it's got a Hungarian-style pistol? Well, this obviously doesn't make sense. And the 7th item is actually about tabanjas, which are sold separately. Tabanjas, when they are the work of the unmanly Hungarians skilled in making them, or of local masters that resemble these, they cost 140 aspas. So what I have come to the conclusion is that tabanja at this stage means the Michele lock. And there's a very good reason for thinking that. But let me just come to the end of my evidence from this list, which is, you can see that we've now come, after the tabanjas in the list comes the stocks. And they just talk about stocks until they get to point number 13, and it's stock of maple wood made for a musket with a tabanja. So it's absolutely clear that the tabanja is on the musket. And then stock for a small musket with a tabanja. And then it goes back to saying stock of hornbeam wood for an ordinary musket. So we understand that these stocks are made for ordinary muskets, whereas these are made for muskets with a tabanja. So that's why I think that what we can see here is the shift between only having guns with matchlocks to having some guns which also have Mikale locks. And that what we've got is a picture of what was happening in Istanbul in 1640. So we've got it to... So what happened was, I think, that you never have a pistol which has got a matchlock. They just don't work, because you have to take the pistols out and fire them quick. So the pistols, now they're in Europe, you could have pistols with wheel locks, but the wheel lock is another type of lock we're not discussing because it never catches on in the Ottoman Empire. It's just too fancy. And so the only type of pistols they would have had were ones armed with a Mikale lock. And so the pistol which has a Mikale lock then gets conflated with the Mikale lock itself. And so now the Turkish word tabanca means a pistol, whereas in 1640 it meant a Mikale lock, a lock with a flint in it. And this is... it's very vivid because what tabanca meant before it became applied to firearms was a slap in the face. So if you think of the cock hitting the steel with a flint, whack, it is a flat slap in the face. And so I think it all makes sense, and that's why I feel confident to tell you about my theory, which I have also published. So, of course, what we're then drawn to is that the Mikale lock did not come from Italy or Spain, but it came from Hungary, because the document says these Mikale locks made by Hungarians or in the Hungarian-style Mikale locks made by our own masters. And so then we look to Hungary, which was in quite a strange condition in this period, because after, from the 1540s, there'd been... 1526, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent invades Hungary from the south and defeats the King Lajos of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs, which is an absolute disaster for the Hungarians. The cream of their nobility and the king are all killed. And that meant, as Lajos was married to Ferdinand of Austria's sister, and Ferdinand was married to Lajos's sister, Ferdinand was the heir of Lajos, according to the Habsburgs, whereas the Hungarian Diet met and it elected a Hungarian called John Zápolya as the King of Hungary. And there's a tussle, and then by 1529, John Zápolya had secured his position by becoming a vassal of Suleiman the Magnificent. In 1540, John Zápolya died, and in 1541, the Ottomans took over his kingdom because it was, what was going on there wasn't to their liking. But they didn't take over all of it. So you have this is the Ottoman-held part. Then Transylvania, which comes into being really at this time as the eastern part of Hungary, though today it's part of Romania. This was ruled by a local prince who was a vassal of the Ottomans, and in fact the king of Hungary was moved there in 1541. And then this part of Hungary, this is called Upper Hungary, which is now Slovakia, and then this is Royal Hungary, which remained under Habsburg rule. And then, in fact, this is Croatia. So they were Slovakia, Hungary, and Croatia were still ruled by the Habsburgs. So it's in these period when there were wars going on, and the problem is when did this transmission take place? And it's quite an odd thing to do because there is no history of this type of lock in Hungary. It's presumption working back from the Ottoman documents that makes you think that the Hungarians were using it, because later on, of course, they started to use the proper flintlock that the French have invented. And we've got a document from 1640. So the later wars between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs can't count because the transmission has already taken place. So the the time that this seems to have taken place, before 1640, the only major conflict was the long war between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs in 1593 to 1606. And during that war, although the war was presented at the end by Mehmed III, who was the ruling sultan at the time, as a great victory because they conquered the Hungarian fortress of Eger, there was a point in 1596 when the Ottomans almost lost at this Battle of Keresztes. And what happened was that the Ottomans almost lost, just as how they had lost against the Mamluks, and then afterwards they start to make changes in the way they go to war. And this is the recommendation of lots of people. And in fact, V.J. Parry found a source which is, he said, a Muslim from Bosnia, writing not long after the Battle of Keresztes in 1596, lamented that the Christians, through their use of new types of handgun and cannon, as yet neglected by the Ottomans, had won a definite advantage over the armies of the Sultan. So this is clearly something that was concerning the Ottomans at the time. And I think that's the point at which they must have adopted this new type of handgun, which is the one with this snap haunce or Michele lock. And it's actually interesting that Gabor Argoston, in writing about cannon, says that in the 1570s that the Habsburgs actually understood that they had an advantage over the Ottomans in terms of the type of handguns they were using, and they actually increased the number of soldiers on the Ottoman front who were armed with these guns. So it wasn't some sort of coincidence that the Ottomans were thrown back on themselves and nearly lost the Battle of Keresztes. It was a result of a deliberate policy on the part of the Habsburg forces. So the similarity between what happened after the Mamluk War and what happened after the Long War, even though they're both theories which need a lot more testing, I think there's something there that shows that there's a parallel, and that these changes actually take place in reaction to misfortunes, and you've survived by the skin of your teeth, and you have to up the ante and to do it. But now let's look at the rise in the status of firearms in the 18th century, because the problem was, in the picture of Sultan Murad III, we saw that he had these two soldiers next to him who had firearms. But the Sultan is always shown, as we saw, with a sword, sometimes with a bow, and they could also use a lance. They're not shown, there he is again, and yet by the 1721, the use of firearms was widespread in the Ottoman army because they needed them in order to fight their enemies. So what we have is that after 1718, there was a treaty in 1718, the Treaty of Passarowitz, and the Ottomans gave away territory south of the Danube, which was a terrible strategic thing to do, but they did it because they wanted to stop the wars. From 1683 to 1718, there had been a series of wars with the Habsburgs, and the Ottomans had lost Hungary, and they had actually then retreated south of the Danube, and what they needed to do was to revive their economy and to modernize their armed forces. And what seems to have happened is that the Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier from 1718, who's called Damad Ibrahim Pasha, they took an interest in firearms, and it's from this time that we have recorded the Sultan using firearms. And this is, I'm not going to expect you to read this. It's in Ottoman, which if it was written Arabic script, some of you might have understood some of the words, but for our sins, we now often use text in transcription. But I just wanted to show you, here's the word tabanja. So this, of course, gets me excited. But also, that here's the word Chasar. And Chasar is the Hungarian word for emperor. And in fact, this is a very important thing. This must have been done after the Treaty of Passarowitz, because before the Treaty of Passarowitz in the 17th century, or at least before the unsuccessful wars of 1683 to 1718, The Ottomans called the Habsburg the King of Germany. They never allowed them the title of emperor. But part of the deal of 1718 was that the Ottomans now called the Habsburg emperor by the Hungarian term Császár, which means, it's actually the word Caesar. It means emperor. And I want to, this is the first time I'm going to mention archery, because this is Okmeydanı, which means arrow field, which is part of the coast of the Golden Horn, the Haliç, or Khalij in Arabic, in Istanbul, which was an open ground. You can see that it's sloping, and it was used for archery practice. And there is one monument there to a shot fired by the greatest Ottoman calligrapher called Şeyh Hamdullah. And he was a very good archer, as well as being a very great calligrapher. And there is a relationship, it's always said, because this, your upper arm, called bazu in Ottoman texts, has to be very strong if you're going to be an archer, to pull back the bow. And this gives you a great steadiness in your using your pen. So the idea is that there's a link between calligraphy and archery. And if I tell you that Ahmed III, I wouldn't say he's the second greatest Ottoman calligrapher, because you've got Hafiz Osman, but Ahmed III was not only a good calligrapher, he was a very important calligrapher. And so he's good at archery, because you practice archery to strengthen your arms for calligraphy, but also to defend yourself, as part of your training. And then you also become a marksman. And so he is expanding the roles of the Sultan. But what he did was, he then started, at least we don't know of any, but we've got this poem, because the poem is made to go on a stele like this, to record a great shot by the Sultan. And there is, I couldn't get the picture, but there is one surviving one of this kind from later on in the 19th century, that is for a shot of marksmanship, a feat of marksmanship. So here is the same poem translated into English, which is, while passing through the untamed wilderness one day, as though riding in state, that sun-like Sultan, whose court is equal to Solomon's, graced this happy place with his presence, whereupon his august nature desired to fire at a target. He took aim at a Frankish ducat from 85 paces. He fired his gold-figured gun from this very spot. And then we get to the bit that's got Tabanja in it. The lock went snap. The emperor's face was blown to bits. While the coin was where no eye could reach it, he struck that cursed man right through the eye. And then there's a couple of lines which is very difficult to translate, which are about how this is also presaging great victories to come. And at the very spot where he stood when he took up his gun and fired, he erected this elegantly carved stone facing the target. By firing the gun, he gouged the coin. In marble, he erected a monument. May God preserve the emperor of the inhabited quarter from missing his shots. So here you have the Sultan Ahmed III being recorded by his major poet, Sayyid Vehbi, in this fate. Now, here is if we'd put an ordinary ducat 85 paces away and he'd fired it through the eye, we'd be very impressed. In fact, we wouldn't really believe it. But if we remember that at the Treaty of Passarowitz, the Habsburgs might well have sent the Sultan some commemorative medals about their victory. And here we have a 15 ducat piece that was issued by the Emperor Leopold, who was the predecessor of the Emperor Charles, with whom Ahmed III concluded the Treaty of Passarowitz. It weighs almost 52 grams, and it has a diameter of 42 millimeters, so 4 centimeters. So you can imagine that this thing would have been a bit more noticeable at 85 paces than, and of course I don't know it's this one, but maybe a gold coin of this type, which is an oversized coin rather than just an ordinary ducat. And if we remember that Ahmed III's brother, Mustafa II, the Ahmed III, and then his successor, Mahmud I, were very, very keen to restore the Ottoman coinage. And here are some coins they issued. That the choice of a foreign, an Austrian Habsburg coin, actually fits in to the fact that Ahmed III is the Sultan who reminted gold coins for the first time since about 1600. So it's actually all wrapped up into his self-presentation as a great ruler in lots of different ways, like marksmanship to do with military prowess. We're at peace at the moment, but we're learning how to fight the enemy at the same time as we're restoring the economy, and we can issue gold coins. It makes a story. And another poem that commemorates Ahmed III's shooting of the Habsburg ducat was written by another courtier called Izzet Ali Pasha. And after an eulogy of the Sultan, the poet describes how Ahmed raised his gun to his august upper arm. Now, we'd call it shouldering the gun, but they see it as raising the gun to the august upper arm and firing it at the coin from 80 paces. With one shot, he hit the ducat straight through the middle, and to quote the poem's most original image, through his great strength, the Sultan converted the gold coin into the ring shape of an archer's thumbstool. So the coin, firing guns, archery, and then calligraphy are all linked up in this persona of Ahmed III. And in fact, just to give you an example of his calligraphy, here's the fountain of Ahmed III in Istanbul, and here is the inscription that gives the date, and that was designed by Ahmed III himself. And here is a tura, which is not unlike the tura on the gold coin he issued. And actually, we can't tell much about the history of the gold coins because the sultans of this period only put their accession date on it. So you don't know which year the coins were issued, which is completely unlike the history of coins earlier on, when you're told a lot by the dates. But here is the sultan's own version of his tura. So he did take calligraphy very seriously. And so here we have another poem by Sayyid Vehbi, which actually refers to a similar feat, but not quite as good, of course, because it's by the Grand Vizier, but it's Damad Ibrahim Pasha, who was Grand Vizier from 1718 to 13. And that shows that actually we're going down the scale from the Sultan to the Grand Vizier, and now I want to take you down even further. So if we... here is a map of Istanbul, and here we have Topkapi Palace. Now, Topkapi Palace had not been the residence in the 17th century. The sultans had preferred to go hunting in Edirne, where they lived. And in fact, there was a revolt under Ahmed III's elder brother, which forced the sultan to come back to Istanbul. So Topkapi is certainly where Ahmed III had to live, because they wouldn't let him live anywhere else. But that didn't mean he couldn't go on journeys around Istanbul. So here we have the Golden Horn. We've got the site of Ok Meydanı here, which is where that the archery practice was done. But the archery practice was done on a slope. Further up, there's a flat land here at Eyüp, but that, of course, is a great pilgrimage center, and the land round it was used for cemeteries. And then we go all the way up here, and up here is Kağıthane, which means paper mill, but it's just the name for this area of Istanbul. And this is the largest area of open flat land in the vicinity of Istanbul in about 1720. So this is the closest place they can go to do sports. And so Ahmed III and Ibrahim Pasha developed it as an imperial residence with a sort of a summer palace called Saadabad, the abode of happiness. And in this flat area, now you can see it's not quite so nice these days. So this is this is the motorway that now runs across it. This is the bit around the mosque that's still open land and is used as a park. But here is the straight waterway, the Jadvalisim, the straight rule, as it's called, which was part of the development. And this is all completely surrounded by the city. But we know what it looked like in 1793, because we have this Ottoman miniature. And even in our eye, we have to get rid of the ladies who are there visiting for the day and think of it as a place where it was also used by men, and they were using it for all sorts of things, like the game of Jireed and all sorts of things like that, pastimes. And in 1723, there were improvements made to Saadabad, and to celebrate the completion of those improvements, Dahmad Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, organised an entertainment for the Sultan on the 8th of July, 1723. The guests included the empire's senior judges, who made a show of their skill in front of the sovereign, one after the other. Those who fired accurately and hit the target were rewarded with gifts and presents, and even those who drowned in the sweat of shame because their shot missed the target were given a ducat as they passed in front of the Grand Vizier. That's what a contemporary chronicler says. And this was not a one-off. It became, from this point onwards, it becomes normal to go there to do marksmanship. And Jean-Claude Flachat, who was a Lyon merchant who was in Istanbul in the middle of the 18th century, said the sultans go very often to Saadabad to amuse themselves in this charming plain. And he lists the activities they watched included target practice with bows and guns. So we've reached the point in 1723, after you've got 1718, the Treaty of Passarowitz, the Sultan starts to practice marksmanship and destroys a coin. And then in 1723, they start to make the judges of the empire practice marksmanship. They've lifted the status a lot. And this is where the gun that I'm supposed to be talking to you about comes in. Because here it is, M49 of 1946 in the V&A. It's a very smart, but not particularly unusual 17th century gun with a Michelet lock. And it's got on it a little verse, which is probably a midakhil, done in gold encrustation. And it uses the word bazu, the upper arm, and it says, "The man who shoulders this gun will take revenge on the enemy. Its craft is fiery by nature. It cannot endure conciliation." So it's a really aggressive gun, which doesn't come as a great surprise, I think, especially to Sheikh Hossa. And if you look, it's got a Michelet lock, and the decoration you can see here, this decoration here and here, is 17th century. And what's happened, or it could be very early 18th century, but there's these bits of silver added here and here and here. And when we look at these bits of silver, they're decorated in absolutely the style. I mean, I was really amazed when I first saw it, because it is absolutely the style of the period between 1718 and 1730, when Ahmed III was encouraging people to do marksmanship. And not only that, it's got it's got an assay mark, which is the Tura of Sultan Ahmed III. And what I've come to the conclusion is, when I first saw this long time ago, I saw that it had these special Ahmed III mounts, but I couldn't understand why. And then, when I saw it the second time after doing this research, I realized that this gun has been upgraded. In other words, when they got all the people, like the judges, to start doing marksmanship, they needed guns which were fit for their status as gentlemen of the empire. And therefore, they couldn't make enough so quickly. And so what they did was, they added beautiful silver mounts to the gun in order to make it more respectable for a member of the upper classes. And that's where I end. So thank you for your attention.